All right, everybody, thanks for joining us today. We're going to take another look at another document-based question, this one from period 6. So you can see here behind me, got FDR there smoking his cigarette there. We're going to start talking about the New Deal. And again, a lot of times on the AP exam, they like to ask questions about the economic periods of, did this work? Did it not work? What specifically worked? And the New Deal is one that's an easy one to ask about because there's just so many different programs that went on during that time that you have a lot to choose from, and they have a lot of resources on that they can show you. So this is back from 2003. The question was, analyze the responses of FDR's administration to the problems of the Great Depression. How effective were these responses? How did they change the role of the federal government? Use the documents and your knowledge of the period 1929 to 1941 to construct your essay. So do notice kind of what our categories will be here. They've given us a few things. They said, first of all, were they effective? And how did they change the government? So I think you've got 3 body paragraphs right there that they're asking. Number 1, which ones were effective? List them. Number 2, which ones weren't effective? List them. Then number 3, which ones changed the role of government, right? So there you go. Some were effective, some weren't. And what were their effect on the role of government? So there's your 3 body paragraphs. So keep that in mind as we walk through these. Notice if they stand out to you as either A, being effective, B, not being effective, or C, changing changing the role of government. So document A, I'm gonna read it out loud, especially for those of you on the phone there. It's one of the great mysteries of the city where women go when they are out of work and are hungry. There are not many women in the bread line. There are no flop houses for women as there are for men, where a bed can be had for a quarter or less. You don't see women lying on the floor of the mission in their free flops. They obviously don't sleep under newspapers in the park. There is no law, I suppose, against their being in these places, but the fact is they rarely are. Yet there must be as many women out of jobs in cities and suffering extreme poverty as there are men. What happens to them? First of all, that's a really good question, right? 1932, they're saying, look, we see all these really poor women in the cities. Where are the men? Where are the women? You can see the men, but you can't see the women. Where do you think the women are? Why are they not seeing the women?
Because the women are at home?
Yeah, I think that's a good guess, right? That the women, they're not the ones that are going to go out and do this stuff. If they have kids, they're going to really stay close to home. They're going to stay there with the kids. So you see the men that are out looking for jobs, and they're the ones that are out kind of waiting in these lines and whatnot. That does not mean the women aren't affected by it. I think that's really the point they're trying to get across here in 1932, is not that women aren't affected by it, but they are. You just don't see them as much. So they are suffering these extreme poverty, and that's what's going on. So I think we're talking 1932. Document A is showing you that there wasn't much effect, okay? So I would put document A as not much of an effect. They're still saying, look, things are really bad. There's extreme poverty. We don't see the women, but they're still dealing with this just as bad as well. So that's a bad problem, and that hasn't been fixed or hasn't been anything to adjust to it. And notice the time period here is 1929 to 1941. So we're right in the middle of that time period, and things are still bad. So I think that would absolutely go to that point. And I think that's important to note here too, is that, women, they are very restricted. Does anybody remember the 3 careers that women are really going to primarily be seen as occupants of until really the 1960s? Nurses, secretaries, and teachers. That was really the primary jobs that women held. Now, by the way, we still have a lot of women in those jobs, but just at the time, that was really viewed as, kind of the proper jobs that they would allow women to have, and teachers, particularly like younger teachers for younger students. But yeah, that really, it takes to the 1960s before you really see that change. And so, yeah, the women are not out in these kind of work lines looking for a job at this point, because not because necessarily they wouldn't take a job, but because a lot of these places weren't going to hire women. Okay, let's take a look at document B. Document B is a letter to Senator Robert Wagner, March 7th, 1934. It seems very apparent to me that the administration at Washington is accelerating its pace towards socialism and communism. Nearly every public statement from Washington is against stimulation of business, which would in the end create employment. Everyone is sympathetic to the cause of creating more jobs and better wages for labor, but a program continually promoting labor troubles higher wages, shorter hours, and less profits for business, which seem to me as leading us fast to a condition where the government must more and more expand its relief activities and will lead in the end to a disaster for all classes. Okay, so this letter to a senator obviously has got a lot of concern in it, okay? And honestly, at the end, notice he says, look, it's not going to help. It's kind of this never-ending thing. And again, guys, if you remember, when we talk about FDR, FDR was incredibly charismatic in 1934. He's just, this is still kind of the early days of his New Deal programs. And so you have a lot of this kind of pushback that it's just kind of up in the air. Is this going to really be effective or not? One of the things I do want you to remember is you're always going to have this group of supporters that think that what FDR is doing has to be done. You're always going to have this group that is firmly against what he's doing. And then you have this group in the middle that they like some of the programs and they don't like some. They think some are an overstep, but some are appropriate. So you kind of have those three camps on this issue. And this is obviously someone that does not like it, does not think it's effective. So again, I would put document B in not effective, or I would put it in the category of change the role of government, okay? Because at the end, they talk about where the government must more and more expand its relief activities, okay? So they're saying, like, look, what FDR has started is what the government's going to continue to do. He's changed it. He's changed the role of government. So I think you could either say it's not effective because he mentions that too, or you could put it in the paragraph to say that it's just growing the role of government. It's drastically changed it. Now we got a political cartoon. So this, again, another one out of 1934. So we have FDR, and it might be hard to see. It said, "It is evolution, not revolution, gentlemen." And he's pointing to a tree, and on the tree it says New Deal. And on the tree that says New Deal, it's got all of these acronyms. It's got RFC, AAA, CCC, SAP, SAB, and you might can make out some other ones, CWA. Yeah, those are kind of the ones I can really make out there. So if you guys remember that, those acronyms there, that's the alphabet soup of New Deal programs. They all had these different acronyms. So why is he saying it is an evolution, not a revolution? Why would they have President Roosevelt saying that? What do you think he means by that? It's an evolution, not a revolution.
Because it's changing in a good way, and like because it's helping America grow into a better, like it's evolving.
Great point. Okay, in a good way. I think Antoine's exactly right. I think that when you see the word revolution, while we talk about the American Revolution in good terms, people don't tend to like get excited about something that's a revolution. I think now we have some political figures who've done a good job of kind of marketing that in a good way, right? But a lot of times when you say revolution, you're meaning it like, oh, is this going to be crazy? And he's saying, look, it's not crazy. This is just like the way we evolved. Like Antoine said, it's this good change over time. Like it's not as drastic as you people are making it out to be. So that's, very smart of FDR to kind of package it that way. But also like this cartoonist right here, when we talk about like his intended audience, what's he trying to do? What do you think is the purpose of this? What do you think he's arguing? First of all, it's a good change, but also it's not a big change. So it's really what the government should be doing. That's kind of his argument here. Is like people are telling you this is like really changing the role of government. He's saying, no, this is really what we should be doing. We should be doing these things. So I would put this as an effective. This is making the case that this is very effective. Again, to Antoine's point, this is good change. It was a good change over time. This is what you would want to happen with your government. This is your government being productive and answerable. Okay, so I would put that in the effective category. So now let's look at D. William Lloyd Garrison Jr., The Hand of Providence, The Nation, November 14th, 1934. You guys might not have remembered seeing other sources from The Nation. The Nation is typically more liberal newspaper. It has its roots all the way back here before World War II. But yeah, it's typically known as more of a left-wing paper. They write really kind of political argumentative pieces. So I mean, they can kind of fall usually on the left So let's read what it says here. The New Deal, being both a philosophy and a mode of action, began to find expression in diverse forms, which were often contradictory. Some assisted and some retarded the recovery of industrial activity. An enormous outpouring of federal money for human relief and immense sums for public works projects started to flow to all points of the compass. $6 billion was added to the national debt. A bureaucracy in Washington grew by leaps and bounds. And finally, to lend the picture the heightened academic touch, John Maynard Keynes of Cambridge, England, commenced the plan of buying utopia for cash. So, what are they arguing here? What would you put this in the category of effective, not effective, or radically changed government? What do you think? Notice this part. $6 billion of the debt, a bureaucracy growing by leaps and bounds, leading to the picture of a heightened academic touch. So this is really making the argument things look a lot different now. That some of these things weren't good, so I think you could say it's either not effective, but I also think this is talking about the changing of the government. And by the way, that's something we see now a lot, right? I mean, we see a bigger bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. We see a much more active government in helping its citizens. And again, you can argue kind of what that line is and where it went too far, but there's no doubt that now we do have the expectation that government will do those things, that it is government's role. And we've tended to grow the bureaucracy and want those people to continue to help more the everyday life of Americans. So that's absolutely changed the role of government. Or you could say that it was not effective in helping. So they're kind of making that as a negative. They're kind of describing that as a negative there. Okay, so let's take a look at 1935. We have a little picture here. It says a monthly check to you for the rest of your life, beginning when you are 65. So we're talking about here Social Security. And so it goes on down, tells you who's eligible and how to return an application. So by the way, this is, you can probably, it might be hard for you to make out, but that is the United States seal there. So this came from it says at the top here, what division? Print and Photograph Division of the Library of Congress is where it's housed, but this came from the government. So the government's describing their program, which is Social Security, to pay you money when you turn 65. Now, do we still have Social Security in place today? Yeah. Let's see.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is it popular today?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you see anybody like about to turn 65? They're like, I don't want that money. Everybody talks about that, right? Like when I turn 65, I get Social Security. It's a big deal. It's something that's highly viewed. I mean, most people have a very popular view of it. Now, we do have some issues with paying for it. If you guys, it's kind of the same thing with Medicare and Medicaid. I think most people have a positive view of those things. There are arguments about how big they should be and how you pay for them. But generally in its scope originally, you had a lot of people, and if you forget, so Medicare is for the elderly as well, over 65. Medicaid is for those that fall below the poverty line. At least that was originally. Now we've modified them some. So there's some other things with them now as well. But that was originally what you see these programs that came out. But Social Security was one of the first. Okay, that if you turn 65, you got a monthly check. So I think this could either be a positive. You could put this in it was a positive effect, or I think you could even make the argument that it changed government, right? I mean, you don't hear people like giving their Social Security check back now. You literally hear people talk about, hey, when I turn 65, I get this check. By the way, does anybody, and this is where you get like the financial problems that come with this, you hear some people talk about sometimes. You may want to guess what the life expectancy was in 1935, how old the average person lived to be? 63.
I was just going to say 60.
You're going to say 60? Yeah, see?
Yeah.
Why were you going to say that?
I don't know.
You're just guessing? Okay.
It was 60, yeah.
Okay, so you were pretty darn close.
Nobody was really getting this money or the benefits.
Exactly. So first of all,
that's why they made it 65?
Yep. They had to be 65 to get this. So Number one, first of all, women always live longer than men. Okay, so that's kind of interesting, right? I guess that women, y'all just tend to make better decisions than we do. Okay, so the women, it was like the women were almost 60, 64, 65, and the men were almost 60 that they died at. So that averaged out to like 63. And then the interesting part is, again, most people aren't going to get this benefit because they're going to die before they turn 65. So everyone's paying taxes, but more than half of the people are never going to live to be this old. Well, now today, the average life expectancy for a woman is like 81 and a man is like 77. So we live much longer now. So a lot more people get these checks. And that's one of the problems. Like if you guys ever hear, like Republicans and Democrats, they always have a plan of like how to fix Social Security. That's why they're always talking about that, because as our technology gets better, as people are healthier, it's good, right? I mean, that's not a bad thing. But as that continues to happen, we have more and more people who get these checks, which then requires more and more money to go to the program. So that's why you always hear like politicians talking about how they're going to fix Social Security. And by the way, the reason that's always a very popular thing during elections is, think about people over 65, they vote. Okay, like my grandpa is nearly 90 years old, and that guy, like, he votes in every single election. I mean, like, older people are always like very attuned to like politics and whatnot. And so like people over 65 really are worried about their Social Security. So that's why you always hear politicians like, hey, I'm going to make it better, or I'm going to make sure that you always get it, or whatnot. Like, that's why that's always like such a political talking point. And young people are like, dude, I'm not very worried about like what happens on like I got bigger problems right now to worry about than when I turn 65. But older people, like, they're worried about that check they get every month. So that's a big concern to older people. So again, you see how it's changed the way Americans view that. Like, we all kind of look forward to being 65 and starting to get that assistance. But also it's also interesting, right? Before this point in time, did the government just give you a check for like making it to be so old? No, the government didn't do things like that. But look at how we are now. You guys might know family members or friends that got that stimulus check that we just got from the government. There's not a lot of people saying, the government shouldn't give us any money. Like, why would you ever give us any money? Like, we don't really turn that down anymore. But until 1934, you really didn't ever see that happen. Like, the government didn't cut people a check. They just didn't. It just never happened. There's actually a big legal case about this as well, is can the government do that? Can they write you a check? So that's interesting. That's a whole other story if we want to get into that sometime too. All right. Let's do a couple more. We got a couple of short ones here because I wanted to include, we have some famous individuals here that have some comments that I wanted to get to before we kind of put it all together. Document F. This is Charles Evans Hughes. This is a Supreme Court case, Schechter versus the United States in 1935. The question of chief importance relates to the provision of the codes to the hours and wages of those employed. It is plain that these requirements are imposed in order to govern the details of defendants' management of their local business. The persons employed are not employed in interstate commerce. Their wages have no direct relation to interstate commerce. The authority of the federal government may not be pushed to such an extreme. Okay, let's kind of dig into this for a second. So what are they? First of all, they're arguing that the federal government can't do something. So let's look at what are they saying the government, what did the Supreme Court say the government can't do? They're talking about codes to the hours and wages to those employed. Persons employed are not employed in interstate commerce. Their wages have no direct relation to interstate commerce. So the argument here is, can the federal government come in and make certain demands of the hours and wages of employees? And at this point in time in 1935, they're saying no, they can't, because it has no direct relation to interstate commerce. Now that's going to change, guys. That's going to change in the courts in the 1960s. But at this point in time, they're saying, look, we don't think the government can do that. So that is a great example of a change, because we don't see that stay the same. So we can put that down as a change in government. Or you could even make the argument there that it showed that those programs were not effective. One of the things I do want you to remember as we talk about the New Deal So Roosevelt, remember the cartoon of the tree I just showed you, where all those programs, some of those programs get deemed unconstitutional at the beginning. Then again, if you think about what all Roosevelt did while he was president, Roosevelt decides to try to pack the Supreme Court, where he wants to add all these justices to the court so that they're more in line with what he thinks. Now that does not work. He's not able to get those extra people on the Supreme Court. But guess what does happen? It really impacted the court. The court really saw this as a threat to them, so they start siding more with him. So you don't see as many rulings like this moving forward. You see a lot of people getting on board with the New Deal program, so they continue to move forward. So I would put that as it's a change in government, but it's also not effective. So let's do one more. Let's do NBC radio broadcast. This is John Lewis, 1936. It is the refusal of employers to grant such reasonable conditions and to deal with their employees through collective bargaining that leads to widespread labor unrest. The strikes which have broken out, especially in the automobile industry, are due to such employee trouble. Huge corporations such as U.S. Steel and General Motors have no right to transgress the law, which gives to the workers the right of self-organization and collective bargaining. Guys, whenever you hear the term collective bargaining, just remember that's them putting together a union, more or less. It's them arguing together, bargaining collectively, or asking for something as a group. So what you see here is the argument being made that these employers are not giving them, notice it says, to grant reasonable conditions to deal with employees through collective bargaining. And then it talks about these huge companies still do not give their employees those kind of collective bargaining rights. So you're seeing this kind of growth in labor laws, growth in the ability of laborers to organize. So again, that is document G. So again, do we see a lot of unions still in place today? We definitely do, right? I mean, we still have unions of auto workers. We have unions of teachers. We have unions of different professions. So that's something that absolutely has stood the test of time coming out of the New Deal. I'm going to scroll. I wanted to show you guys a chart before we move on. So this is the unemployment of non-farmers by percentage and number, okay? So on the left, it'll say percentage of non-farmer workers unemployed. And then you just have the numbers. So you guys just look at when we're talking 1930 to 1935, that huge spike in unemployment there. And then you start seeing this precipitous drop after 1940. Okay, can anybody tell me why you see that drop after 1940? Why did all of a sudden were people able to find jobs after 1940? You could say there was some success to the New Deal programs, but something else happened as well.
Was that when the cars started? I don't.
Well, we do have that in the 1930s. So you have the automobile industry that you're really seeing here. First of all, helping keep these people employed in the early 1920s. But remember, 1941. The U.S. is going to enter World War II. So when they enter World War II, as Antoine pointed out, you have all the car factories, you have all these factories in place that quickly convert to wartime material factories. So they're producing planes, weapons. So all of a sudden, everybody's got jobs. The government's paying them to produce these wartime materials. So that's a big reason there for that. So that is a change in the positive direction, potentially, that it was effective, some of the government actions, but until then, we really don't see that, okay? So now I'm gonna jump over to the whiteboard. So notice, remember, we have an argument that we're gonna start off by saying, hopefully now, after we've done several of these together, you all feel comfortable doing like a thesis statement over these and kind of the body paragraphs. So during it was like 1925 to 1940, the New Deal programs enacted by FDR were effective in helping unemployment and what was the other one? Unemployment and what was C? I'm trying to remember what C was. And let me scroll back up to C. Oh, got it. And evolving government to meet the needs of the people. However, the New Deal programs didn't help women at home living in poverty with their children, and the New Deal, y'all can tell I'm a terrible typer, the New Deal programs also changed the way government interacted with citizens by directly giving money to individuals. Therefore, the New Deal had some success and failures while drastically changing the role of government. All right, I want to point out a few things here. Again, notice what I did. I think y'all are probably looking at this going, that's not very hard, and I hope you don't think it's that hard. Like your thesis statement, I gave enough, like did I say exactly how they gave money to citizens? I'm gonna explain that later. I'm gonna explain Social Security, that when you turn 65, you gotta check, and I'm gonna explain that that's a very popular program. If you also want to explain that, hey, there's also this issue with it, which is that most people didn't live to be 65, and now they do. If you want to go into that as some background information as to why that changed government, that's a great example that now we assume we're going to get that. And guess what? Guys, even right now, when businesses are shut down and something bad happens, again, we're okay with the government cutting us a check. Again, before 1930, you just didn't hear that kind of discussion. But now, after having done this multiple times, like, well, yeah, if people are out of work or people are out of business, absolutely, help them out. You also have the women at home in poverty. Again, we talked about that. I didn't explain why you don't see them at the unemployment lines and why you don't see them out in public. Again, that's something for you to go into, which is, women couldn't hold jobs. There weren't very many industries that hired them. So they had to stay at home with the kids, and they really couldn't help out because that really wasn't much of an option for them. I also talked about the government evolving to meet the needs of the people. Again, talk about that cartoon with all of Roosevelt's plans, that he had all these different programs that were there to help all those individuals. Are there any specific government programs that you guys can remember that came out of the New Deal era there? Are there any of those acronyms you can remember? Yeah, the Citizens Conservation Corps, the CCC, the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, where they worked on the dam that provided electricity. AAA is an easy one too. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, which allowed people to work on agriculture and buy a lot of their meat and whatnot. You know, those are some of the most popular ones, the Work Progress Administration, WPA. Those are the ones that built bridges and things like that. So they would do like projects. So you would see them interacting in that way. So you saw all those type of things. So again, if you want to go into any detail about any of them, FDIC, the SEC, again, any of those type of programs or things that came directly out of the New Deal. And again, I do want you to notice, and whenever they ask you about this type of topic, notice, and again, something that's good even going forward for you guys, which is, number one, usually things in history, especially like policies and politics, there are two different kind of like, there's always going to be a side that's going to talk about the good things they did, and there's always a side that's probably going to talk about how if they were bad or weren't beneficial. That's really up, just like right now, right? That's up for you to decide. And the good thing about when you write a historical essay, as long as you provide evidence, you can argue whichever way you want, okay? That's really your opinion, right? Was this a really good thing for America? If you have the evidence to support your argument, you can make that case. This is one of the more controversial moments in American history, okay? And you have one school of thought that says FDR went way too far, that he grew the government way too big, he ran us into debt, he made the government do things that it originally had not done, and now because he did this, there's no going back. That now whenever something bad happens, the government wants, people want the government to help them out, okay? And they shouldn't have done those things. That's one point of view. There's the other point of view that says, again, I always tell students this, my grandpa is literally named Franklin Delano. Like he is named after FDR. Why was he named after FDR? Because if it wasn't for FDR, my grandpa and his dad didn't think they would have made it. They thought they were stuck in the Great Depression and would have never come out of the Great Depression, that would have been decades. And so there are these people that make the argument that FDR saved America through the Great Depression, that he was that constant voice, that if people didn't have work, they would have quit. They wouldn't have kept trying to move forward, that they wouldn't have been able to feed their families, that we had to run a deficit in order to move forward. And then, of course, the other thing about FDR that is important is even people that are very critical of him for doing the New Deal programs usually are pretty positive about the job he did during World War II. I mean, we defeat Hitler, we defeat Imperial Japan, and something I always like to point out to students is it's easy looking back now, like, hey, we beat Hitler, you know, ha, ha, ha. Because I'm gonna tell you right now, if you were a betting person in 1940, before the United States get involved, things don't look very good for us, okay? It looks like Great Britain and France are done. If you're a betting person in 1944, before D-Day, if you're also someone right before the Battle of the Bulge, you might have been concerned that the Germans were able to bust through our lines and again break apart this huge aggressive maneuvering that we'd been doing for months. There are multiple times during this war that it doesn't look really great for the Allies. So the fact that he navigates all of that, produces an atomic bomb, which allows us to end up winning the war in 1945. Now, he dies before we drop it, but it's his administration that really helps put that together. I mean, even if you're critical of the guy for some economic decisions, he tends to be a pretty popular president because of the way he handled World War II. And guys, when I ask students who they think are the best presidents, we always see Washington and Lincoln are usually number one and number two. Like students usually flip them back and forth. One of the other ones, like usually number like three, is usually in everybody's top five, is FDR. You know, we get out of the Great Depression, we win World War II. I mean, those are two of the biggest moments in American history that he's president for. So it's interesting to kind of see people's takes on FDR because you do have some that still keep that critical view of his economic policies. But overall, he's one that gets ranked pretty high. I mean, if you go to Washington, D.C., and you look at the monuments, he's got one of the biggest monuments there, and it's like these 4 parts. There's 4 different parts of it. I mean, so you look at the people who have monuments up there, you got Washington, you got Lincoln, you got Jefferson, and again, Roosevelt's up there with them with a really big monument as well. So that's just an interesting view of the way that he's perceived there. So let me go ahead. I'm going to jump back onto this and kind of show you how we can kind of continue here on the whiteboard. So if that's how we've got this part set up, I'm going to show you so body paragraph number 1, we would talk about, what did we say at the beginning? Good effects. And we would use sources C, F, and G. Body paragraph number 2, we talk about the bad effects. And we would use sources, can't spell, sources A, B, okay? And the third paragraph, we're going to talk about the way that it changed government. And we're going to use sources, well, I had F. Actually, I had F there. And then we can find one more. We skipped a few. So there's how we group the sources. And again, in those paragraphs, we make that argument. Now, the last thing I want to talk to you guys about, so this is the first paragraph, okay? This is the second paragraph. This is the third, this is the fourth, okay, the 3 body paragraphs. And then what we want to end with is we want one more paragraph, and it's called contextualization. It's where we talk about what happened before and what happened after. So what your last paragraph would be is something to the effect of, before the New Deal, government really did not ever provide jobs for people. Well, even when we look at the 1890s and 1880s, when there were economic problems, that was never suggested. There were tax cuts, there were trying to make more money, but no one ever talked about, in a large degree, giving people jobs or giving people money. World War II, or the Great Depression happens, and all of a sudden we have that desire come to fruition. Then afterwards, we have the Social Security program, which is still in effect today. What do we add on top of that? Medicare, Medicaid. And from now on, and now we have Obamacare as well, that came about very recently. So what do we have? We have government programs to provide people certain services. That has become more and more popular over time because of this. But notice what I did there. I mentioned a few very specific things. I mentioned Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare. Those are 3 specific pieces of evidence that show what? That show that what FDR did right back then also continued throughout time. One other thing I might mention, when y'all were alive during Obamacare, and y'all might have been pretty young, but did everybody want that to happen? No, the Republicans were against it. It's just like FDR, right? There were people that were very for it, very supportive of it, and there were a group of people against it. Then there was this group in the middle too that were like, well, we like it, but we think it should look like this. We don't want it to go overboard. So it's interesting, and you guys can always kind of, you take AP government next year, we talk a lot about the political spectrum. You have a far right that's usually very limited government. You have a far left that's usually a very, very large government to help do things. And then, you usually play somewhere in the middle. A lot of Americans are kind of in this middle territory, but we've kind of seen that whole ball shift to the left after FDR, where most Americans are supportive of some of these government programs. If you'd ask people in 1920, should the government give you a check when you turn 65, you'd have a large percentage that would say, no way. But now, if you asked Americans that, I think you would find it would be a very small percentage that would be against that government program. So even your very conservative limited government folks tend to support some of these programs. And that's in large part due to the successes of those over time. And so it's interesting, right? It's something that's still, again, I hope that you all take AP government next year, or even if you just take government, you really get to dig into that and kind of see how it's interesting how some of those things stay the same right to now. We're literally having this debate right now. How much should the government do to help people out with coronavirus? That's we're having the same discussions right now as they did back in 1930 on how to deal with unemployment. So, guys, that's all I had today. You guys have anything for me or any other questions? Ms. Smith, I'm really sorry about missing you on the email earlier. I apologize for that. I've tried to fix that email problem there. I don't know if you were on earlier when I was talking about that, but that's my bad, and so I need to make sure that I've checked those out. So I do apologize for that. I'm going to make sure that I can send you some of those older ones. Anybody else? Any questions, comments, famous quotes here before we get off the call today? Antoine, you gonna leave us with anything today?
No.
He's a man of few words.
He looks dead.
I know I mean, he got really depressed talking about the Great Depression. You know what I mean? It can be kind of depressing. So, pick yourself back up. Don't worry, Antoine. We came out of the Great Depression, so we'll come out of this one too. Don't you worry. Yeah. So
there's something
tomorrow,
to remember about FDR with the New Deal programs. As far as he's going with those, he knows there's a point where it's too far. And he's even agreeing with some people that at the time they're saying, hey, you're going too far. He's like, yeah, but I kind of got it. And for some of his critics, especially with things like Social Security, they're saying, why are you giving so many handouts to people? He said it himself, kind of paraphrasing the quote a little bit, it's a hand up, not a handout.
Yep. That's a great point. I mean, and Roosevelt's an interesting one. If you kind of look at this picture behind me, I think Mr. Carnes makes a great point. Like FDR was very wealthy. There's an one of my favorite biographies on FDR is H.W. Brands wrote one called A Traitor to His Class, because that was something the wealthy were like, why are you doing all of this for the poor? Like you increase taxes. You're constantly talking about the poor. It's really fascinating. I mean, he was incredibly wealthy, came out of an incredibly powerful family, but he does have this real drive, and as Mr. Carnes pointed out, even a reluctancy of like, this is me trying to help, and normally I wouldn't want to do all of these things, but because of the situation we found ourselves in, like this is what I feel like we have to do. And he's what, Teddy's nephew? I think that's right, Mr. Carnes. You can correct me if I'm.
I believe it's fifth cousin.
Fifth cousin. There's a great picture of Teddy Roosevelt's parade, where you can see FDR up there watching his cousin there be elected president. So that's a pretty fascinating point of this as well, is two of the most powerful presidents in growing the presidency actually had that blood relation. It's kind of fascinating, right? So there was a great, I kind of plugged some documentaries for you guys. There's one called The Roosevelt that goes all the way through Teddy Roosevelt, all the way through FDR. And they talk a lot about, now, I didn't even mention this, but FDR's wife might be one of the most influential first ladies in American history, Eleanor Roosevelt. I mean, she is an incredible advocate for civil rights. As we talk about civil rights in the next DBQ, one of the things that she was very frustrated that her husband didn't do more for civil rights. She would go meet with civil rights leaders on her own and even be critical of her husband's policies. Like, that was very rare. But she was really outspoken that, look, I get it. We're having a Great Depression, but you know what else is happening? African Americans are being mistreated, and they're getting it even worse because they're getting the racism on top of the Great Depression that's really keeping them down too. So his wife is very involved in the civil rights movement and always wanted him to be more aggressive. And so you see some of the leaders that come out in the 1960s that reference that she actually met with some of those leaders early on and really hoped to move the ball forward. So Eleanor Roosevelt's a great study herself in kind of her influence there at the time. So anything else you want to add there to the end as we're getting off the call there, Mr. Carnes? That's a great insight there on that. I appreciate it, everybody. Thanks for joining. Again, I'll post this later, and we're going to rock and roll tomorrow at 3 o'clock. So I'll have all the Millwood folks with us tomorrow at 3, and any of you McAllister folks that want to join us tomorrow. Again, we're gonna do one more tomorrow, and I'm hoping that we have that special guest for Thursday. We'll see how that works out. If not, I'm going to kind of show you guys what I want to do from here on out over the next couple of weeks, which is slightly different. It's not quite as tedious as this, but again, I want to kind of take you through some different full essays and walk through together what a good one looks like and what a bad one looks like. So we'll get to talk through that a little bit more specifically from here on out. So I hope that was helpful. And guys, I hope you guys stay safe and hang in there. Again, I know it's frustrating being at home, but hey, looks like the end is coming for all of that. So hang in there. Appreciate you guys for joining me today, and I hope to see you soon.